And welcome back, listeners. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. And as is normal, well, becoming very normal, I am here with my esteemed colleagues, plural, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby. Awesome. Love to see the smiling faces. And I know you're back home, so it's always good to be home because you have been on the road a little bit, doing a little bit of traveling. I know we've done a few of the podcast recordings from on the road and everything, but you are now back there officially and behind. If for you listeners who are just listening and not viewing on YouTube, which you can watch this on YouTube also, Dr. Matt, you've got your diploma back there with your
Yeah, that's right. 2026. Certainly, somebody asked me the other day, how it was to be there. And the word that I shared with a person that asked me was a very, very humbling experience to be welcomed into the club of professors at the doctoral level. And yeah, what an honor. Shout out to Professor K, I called him. And now he actually comes over and says, introduce himself as Ken now. So I know that I still have a hard time calling him Ken. He's still Professor K to me. So anyway, all the best to everybody at Edgewood University in Madison, Wisconsin. And if anybody has ever considered getting their doctorate, that's a place to consider. Those professors are top notch there.
Yeah, I think that's so awesome. So, well, and Joanne, you're doing amazing. You're back in the throes of things. We were just having a funny conversation about how you had to find your computer because you still do. You're retired and you're working more now than you ever have been since retirement.
I don't know more, but certainly more diverse things that I'm working on. So it was just a matter of tracking down the right computer for this podcast. So here I am.
Joanne has failed at retirement, that's for sure.
It's because she's so knowledgeable. So here's the thing, listeners. Over the last several episodes, it's a perfect segue. We've talked about fiduciary judgment, almost theoretically speaking, how it forms, how institutions shape it, how regulation influences it, right? And you've been very giving of that knowledge that you have acquired throughout those 25 plus years, we'll call it, right? But in our last episode with Lindsay Day, phenomenal guest, our first guest, shout out to Lindsay, something happened that felt different to me because Lindsay wasn't speaking theoretically. She was describing what fiduciary judgment actually feels like from inside that room that she's there in the boardrooms and things like that. But and what really stood out to me was her description of the difference between competence and excellence. Joanne, I want to start there because Lindsay said something that I wrote down immediately. She said, and I quote, technically speaking, are you following the document? That's step one. But then she followed it with this. What makes an exceptional fiduciary is something or someone who's open to hearing all the facts, quote unquote. And then maybe the most important line, maybe they're really needing help with something and they have no idea what to even ask for. What was Lindsay really saying there?
What Lindsay was describing is the movement from procedural administration into interpretive fiduciary judgment. And that's a major shift that trust officers take through their careers. A competent fiduciary, so just, trust officers are generally competent across the board. They have a very hard job. They do a great job. But a competent fiduciary knows the document and the rules, the standards, and the procedures. All that matters. But Lindsay was describing something that goes beyond technical trust administration. She was describing a fiduciary who understands that people often don't know how to articulate what's actually wrong. And these would be the clients, the beneficiaries. And part of the reason for that is the fiduciary relationship itself is asymmetrical. The fiduciary, a trust officer like Lindsay Day, usually possesses more knowledge, more structure, more interpretive authority, and more experience with the trust, often more emotional distance from the situation. While the beneficiary of the trust may be overwhelmed, embarrassed, confused, intimidated, emotionally exhausted, or unsure what they're even allowed to ask for. So, a beneficiary request itself may not actually represent the underlying need of the client. And that's where exceptional fiduciaries begin operating differently. They understand that fiduciary judgment is not just responding to the literal request. Instead, it's interpreting the human reality underneath that request. And so the exceptional fiduciary slows the moment down long enough to understand what's actually happening before prematurely collapsing into an answer. And that's a completely different level of practice.
And Carter, that distinction is incredibly important because that is what we've discussed as the theory of fiduciary judgment in live practice. A procedural system simply asks, what is the request? But fiduciary judgment asks, like Lindsay was describing, what is really needed here? What does the client actually really need for the particular request they have? And those are obviously fundamentally different questions. Lindsay revealed that excellent is not merely a better, faster process. It's a different form of perception. And that's also where the compass dimensions start becoming visible, the ones that we described in an earlier episode. Because now fairness enters into the equation. Lindsay's identity as a professional trust officer enters. Contextual risk enters into the decision, as well as the emotion, the pressure that Lindsay feels to make a decision that is appropriate for the given context, without abandoning the structure of the document, which we referred to as the anchor. So those are the AFIRE dimensions that we've discussed in an earlier episode. That's not soft judgment. That's advanced fiduciary judgment, what Lindsay called the exceptional fiduciary.
And shout out to Lindsay Day. She is an exceptional fiduciary, just so that we're clear here. And another thing that Lindsay said that honestly stopped me right in my tracks was this. She said, you're looking at the document first to ask, can we? Then, should we? And I know we've even talked about that on here multiple times, but this is like reality for her on a daily basis, right? So, which is kind of the second step in that sequence. And then later she said, yeah, maybe the document kind of allows it, but gosh, I don't really know if we should do this. Joanne, that feels like a huge distinction with regards to fiduciary judgment.
And it is because many people outside the trust industry assume that fiduciary work is mostly technical legal interpretation of the document.
Yeah, like it's all objective, not subjective, right?
Correct. And Lindsay revealed that legality, it certainly is part of it, but it's only the beginning. Can we is the authority. Does the document allow this? Can we do this? That's a simple, I shouldn't say simple, but that's the authority. That's the anchor. Should we is the fiduciary judgment. And those two are not the same thing. The exceptional fiduciary understands grantor intent, consequence, proportionality, future implications, family dynamics, and beneficiary reality. And sometimes the document technically allows something that still does not feel aligned with the spirit of the trust. That's fiduciary tension.
And as we're discussing, Lindsay's quote, "Can we, should we," is essentially my entire dissertation compressed into one sentence. Maybe I should have just talked to her and gotten the entire thing done without the effort. Because fiduciary judgment is not exhausted by legality, as Joanne just said. And the compass becomes incredibly important here. Can we often lives heavily inside the anchors, the document, and that's procedural risk. Do we have the ability to process this particular transaction as a trustee? But should we activates fairness, fiduciary identity, emotional awareness, and prudential judgment. This is why fiduciary judgment becomes so difficult, because the fiduciary is not merely interpreting the authority granted to them in the document. They're interpreting conflicting obligations.
Now we get into the part that honestly made me uncomfortable. And that's saying something. Lindsay said, because you've taught me, right, to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Lindsay said, the safe answer is the answer everybody wants to hear. And when I heard that, I immediately thought, whoa, wait a minute, wait a second here. Are institutions inadvertently influencing fiduciaries away from judgment?
So I think that that's where the risk is for institutions. And not because institutions are bad. They absolutely are not bad. And I have never seen any trust organization that has any intention other than the very, very best fiduciary duty that they can administer. Institutions are actually trying to solve real problems. They're also dealing with things like consistency, the auditability, defensibility, scalability, and operational stability. Those are legitimate concerns. And even things like for auditors, when they come in and they're auditing like various accounts, they try and select accounts across a variety of trust officers in that same organization because they are looking for those things. They're looking for that type of, consistency, operational stability, and the institution is aware of that. So those are, again, as I said, legitimate concerns. Lindsay revealed something very subtle. Over time, those institutional systems can begin rewarding procedural safety more so than interpretive judgment. And eventually, the individual fiduciary internalizes that the safest answer is the correct answer for that room. And that's dangerous because sometimes the safest answer is simply the least uncomfortable answer institutionally. It is not necessarily the best fiduciary judgment for a particular beneficiary for a particular trust account.
And it's a place to pause here and to recognize that that may be the next invisible threat. What am I talking about? What I'm calling the industrialization of fiduciary judgment and potentially influenced by AI. Because industrial systems used in industry like manufacturing, etc., naturally optimized for speed, repeatability, consistency, and defensibility. But judgment doesn't function like industrialization. Judgment requires tolerance of ambiguity, tension, reflection, disagreement, and contextual interpretation. And when the system starts eliminating those things, the compass begins to collapse. That's why we keep saying and reiterating that disagreement is data. Because if the tension disappears too quickly, you probably didn't solve the problem. You protected the assumption, and the invisible threat remains invisible.
Disagreement is data. I mean, that's such an ongoing theme. And as you were talking about like AI and the whole thing, it really, just got me thinking about the future, right? Um, those of you who have been around since the 80s and watching the Terminator, I always think about Skynet, but I digress. Lindsay kept returning to how much fiduciaries learn from one another, right? She said, you really learn a lot from absorbing little bits from all the people that sit next to you every day. And then it really is a collaborative profession. Joanne, that feels incredibly important for systematically maybe being more compliant in my mind.
Well, it is important because Lindsay was describing how fiduciary judgment develops relationally. Yes, it is a collaborative industry. And the other thing that I have noticed in the industry is that, especially if you think back to those old traditional bank trust departments, they'd always have that senior trust officer who had so much institutional knowledge. She knew all the trusts in and out, the names, she knew family names, and they would pass down their knowledge over time to the newer trust officers coming in. So Lindsay was describing how that fiduciary judgment develops relationally, not mechanically and not individually, but relationally through committees, mentors, those senior trust officers that I already mentioned, hallway conversations, also disagreements, as well as observing your peers and discussing difficult cases in committees or even in those hallway conversations. That's how judgment matures. And one of the things Lindsay revealed very clearly is that institutions shape judgment cultures. Some environments encourage discussion, and some environments suppress discussion. Some environments tolerate ambiguity, others want to rush immediately towards closing, towards answering those questions quickly. And that matters enormously as well.
And the theory of fiduciary judgment fully supports that observation. Judgment does not form in isolation. It forms inside interpretive communities, inside institutional systems, inside social reinforcement structures. And this is where bounded ethicality becomes incredibly important, because people gradually normalize the thinking patterns of the environments around them. That means institutions are not merely processing decisions, they're shaping the judgment of the fiduciaries themselves.
All of this is awesome, phenomenal, and what an incredible guest that Lindsay Day was, imparting her wisdom on the application of all these things. So the final thing that really stayed with me emotionally was when Lindsay said, your decision can potentially have a big factor on other people's lives. And then later, this is not transactional business. Joanne, I want you to chime in here first, but what did you hear in that?
What I heard was the weight of fiduciary responsibility. And it's a weight that sits on the shoulders, not just of the trust officers, but of the entire trust organizations. What Lindsay was describing is a profession where decisions are deeply human. Fiduciaries are not merely moving money around, they are carrying interpretive responsibility on behalf of another person's life. And over time, fiduciaries can become deeply connected to families, grantors, beneficiaries, legacies. That changes how the work feels. The exceptional fiduciary does not experience decision making simply as processing transactions. They experience it as stewardship, guardianship of the trust itself.
And in our AFIRE model, that's our I, meaning it's the fiduciary identity operating correctly. Because the fiduciary is not merely administering a document, they are carrying moral responsibility inside of uncertainty. That's why also emotion matters inside of AFIRE. Not emotion replacing judgment, emotion regulating awareness, urgency, and consequence. And what Lindsay revealed throughout this interview is that the best fiduciaries are not emotionally detached. They are emotionally disciplined. And that's very different.
It's so different, and that's so well said. So, what Lindsay Day ultimately revealed is that fiduciary judgment is far more than a process or the policy or documentation or ultimately the technical interpretation. It is interpretive, it is relational, it's adaptive, right? It's tension filled, right? Hold that moment, and deeply human, because these are humans that are connected to this, right? The grantor's intent started this whole thing, right? And maybe the biggest realization of all this is competence follows the document. Excellence interprets human reality within the document. That is an incredibly important distinction. And modern systems often optimize for competence first, while unintentionally constraining excellence. That just might be the next invisible threat. Most organizations go past these realizations. We don't. Dr. Matt, Joanne Eby, thank you so much for allowing me to get a little bit deeper into, the interpretation of what Lindsay was really trying to say. She was such an incredible guest. I learned so much from her. And if nothing else, speaking of human element, I feel like I got a new friend. So, listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. And as a reminder, I know I said at the top of the show, make sure to connect with Dr. Matt Eby on LinkedIn. He's got so much information that he shares on there on a regular basis. His dissertation and his connections, and you'd be hard pressed to find someone that's a better connection, in my humble opinion. Next to obviously his co-author Joanne Eby. So I'm really grateful that Joanne, you were able to come on here again today and be able to allow me to get into that interpretation and let you share your insights into that as well. And Dr. Matt, being able to allow the dissertation, the purpose behind it, to really help to uncover and share that with the audience today too.
Yep, it was really great to have Lindsay on here, and there were, as we said at the beginning, 5 themes that really came out that we tried to go a little bit deeper on today, and then also understand the theory behind that with a little bit of additional explanation. So thanks so much, Carter, for being such a great host. Nobody does it better, and we're really blessed to have you as part of the team here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, absolutely my pleasure. And hopefully next week we'll get a chance to have the incredible duo of Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby. So until next time, listeners, we will see you on the Invisible Threat Podcast. Thank you, everybody.